In this chapter, we will briefly cover Jewish history all the way to the end of the 5th century. The events were intertwined with the history of the rest of the world. There will be some surprises. Stay with us. All seemed quiet during 235 AD. Then the Roman Empire was killed and replaced, in that order, and then another. And for a period of 50 years, there were over 24 different Roman emperors. They all had to deal with an overwhelming amount of problems. It was not a desired role. Of the problems emperors had to deal with were invading armies from across the Rhine, massive devaluation of the coin, and a new and exciting plague of measles. Usually, they also had to deal with their own death, which seemed to take place way too often. Today, this period is called by historians the 3rd century crisis. One can see that Judea was not high on anyone's list for a while. Jews were living everywhere they could. The main hubs at the time were Alexandria in Nile Delta, Rome and Athens, Persia, Iraq, Syria, North Africa, Iberia. A large fraction of Jews lived in Judea and the Galilee. Did they convert to other religions? I suppose they did a little. Did they mix with the Gentiles? Not too often, we think, but perhaps. Jews needed to make use of the ritual bath. Cold countries were obviously less desirable. They also needed the protection of the community, kosher food, a synagogue. In Judea, they had a community, but they had to share the turf with the not-so-friendly Samaritans, with some Christians, many Hellenistic folks of pagan persuasion. You could see that this was not an ideal place for many. One might ask, what were all these Jews doing for a living? They couldn't have been arguing all day over religious practice, although it might have looked that way. In the diaspora, they were prevented from land ownership and had to resort to trade and industry. Jews had the advantage, though, of literacy, as well as a multilingual upbringing. They could speak both Hebrew and the language of the locals. This made them extremely useful in international trade and commerce. Under Emperor Diocletian, known to us for the martyrdom of St. George in that period, I have a movie about that as well. Well, in 301 AD, Armenia, an independent country in the eastern highlands of the Black Sea, declared itself Christian. This was a bombshell for the Roman Empire. In Judea, they probably felt it too. Jerusalem had a big Armenian community. In the Galilee, Jewish scholars were still working on the second compilation of Jewish oral tradition, which will be called the Talmud. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, was still the internal governing body for a while longer, but it experienced serious competition from Jewish internal authority that was forming in Mesopotamia and Persia. And yet, the Galilee Sanhedrin was still leading the pack. In 314 AD, Constantine the Great was fighting a civil war against the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The Edict of Milan caught many in Judea off guard. By 324 AD, it had Christianity become a legal religion which anyone could practice openly. The Jews and Samaritans were horrified that Christians were their sworn enemy. Fear was creeping under the covers of the Jewish settlements. For the next 60 years, pagan Christian persuasions were having it out. Eventually, Christianity took over. Helena, later known as Saint Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine, was already a Christian. She made a pilgrimage to Judea, established several significant Christian sites. The struggle between pagan belief and Christianity was going back and forth. Constantine's son, Constantinus, had reduced much of the rights of the Jews in the empire. For a brief moment in history, Emperor Julian the Apostate supported Judean Jews. They even started working on re-establishment of the temple in Jerusalem. But in 363 AD, Julian was killed while fighting against the Sassanians. The Sassanians had taken over from the Parthians in Persia. They were Zoroastrians. Julian was the last Roman emperor that was pagan. By 384 AD, Christianity had become the official Roman religion. Anyone who was not Christian was threatened. Everybody was so busy with religion those days, they could hardly hear the faint drumbeat from the east, and they definitely weren't taking it seriously. East of the Volga River, the Huns were on the move. The Roman Empire was more or less divided into East and West by then. The East was called Byzantine, and it was based out of Asia Minor. The Huns were unstoppable. They established a huge area of influence in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. They became a threat to everybody. The Huns taught Eastern Europe a lesson they would remember for a while. They left complete devastation in their path. The concept of good and evil, so cherished by Christians, was not part of their idea of warfare. Cruelty, for them, was a mean to an end. The Hun invasion introduced a great amount of fear in the Byzantine Empire. This fear manifested itself in the Byzantine Empire paying a fortune in ransom to keep the Huns from attacking. Consequently, taxes throughout the empire were constantly increasing. Judea had become the Holy Land. Churches were everywhere, monastic life was common, pilgrims were arriving constantly. Jerusalem had its own archbishop, yet the common people were getting poorer and further in debt. Among the Jews and the Samaritans, economic fear and religious frustration were prevalent. This was becoming apparent with Jews moving out east and Samaritans brewing up a rebellion. The first Samaritan rebellion took place in 484 AD. It ended horribly. Attila the Hun died in 453 AD. Europe sighed a breath of relief. The Germanic tribes aligned to reduce his short-term empire. It collapsed within a few years. It will be a while before the people of the Great Prairies will threaten the Western world again. During the early 5th century, many Germanic tribes, which by then composed much of the Roman fighting force, were pushed westwards by the advancing Huns. Their move westwards resulted in the 410 sack of Rome and the establishment of a Visigothic Iberia. This was the first time in 800 years that the city of Rome was defeated. After that, nothing stayed the same. During that time, the 4th and 5th centuries, in the East Roman Empire, a great deal of religious work was carried out. In Judea, for example, several Christian sages and philosophers were actively establishing the ground rules for the new Christian faith. The new form of monastic life had been introduced. Thousands of monks controlled parts of the agricultural farmland, and in Bethlehem, St. Jerome was translating the Bible from Greek to Latin. In the early part of the 5th century, as part of the religious struggle between Christians and non-Christians, riots broke out in Alexandria against the non-Christians. This is also the same time that St. Catherine was killed. Jews amounted to about a third of the city's population of 800,000. After the riots, many of the Jews were forced to leave. Some moved further west into North Africa, some moved south to Yemen and Ethiopia. In the Galilee, during the 4th century, the Jewish Grand Court of 70 wise men was running internal Jewish affairs. It was the Sanhedrin. In 350, the Sanhedrin had to move to the town of Tiberias as a result of a small unsuccessful revolt against Constantine Gallus. In 425 AD, the Sanhedrin was delegitimized by the Roman Empire. It had lost all of its authority over the people and stopped operating. Its role was taken over by the Mesopotamian Jewish Council, further east. And in Rome was taken over at 476 by the Germanic king Ottokar. This to many marked the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Jewish community of Rome was also going through some changes. Many migrated elsewhere, some went to Spain, to stay out of trouble's way. We are going to end this chapter here. It's a good place. Western Roman Empire fell, the Huns were driven out, Samaritans had their rebellion, the Sanhedrin stopped operating. It's time for a break. Stay with us for the next chapter.